The smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke hit Sienna Dalton like a physical wall as she stepped out of the Silver Dollar Saloon into the cool Nevada night, her brother Tommy's dead weight threatening to pull her straight down into the dirt of Reno's Main Street. She adjusted her grip around his waist, feeling the strain in her shoulders and lower back as she tried to keep him upright. Tommy had always been bigger than her, broader in the shoulders and taller by half a foot, and at 23 he had filled out into the kind of solid build that came from working the mines. But tonight, in March of 1882, with liquor flowing through his veins like poison, he might as well have been made of lead. "Come on, Tommy," she whispered, her voice tight with exhaustion and frustration. "Just a few more blocks, please." Her brother's only response was a low groan as his head lolled against her shoulder. His breath reeked of cheap whiskey, and she could feel the dampness of spilled alcohol soaking through his shirt onto her hands. This was the third time this month she had been called to retrieve him from one saloon or another, and each time it got harder to hold on to the hope that he would eventually pull himself together. The street was mostly empty at this hour, past midnight on a Wednesday. The respectable folks of Reno were tucked into their beds, and the rowdier element was still inside the various establishments that lined the main thoroughfare. Sienna was grateful for the relative quiet, even as she struggled with her burden. At least there were fewer witnesses to her family's shame. She had made it perhaps 20 yards when her boot caught on a rut in the road. She stumbled, her grip on Tommy slipping, and for a horrible moment she thought they would both go down. Her heart hammered in her chest as she fought to keep her balance, her muscles screaming in protest. Then suddenly the weight was gone. Strong arms had lifted Tommy clean away from her, as easily as if her brother weighed nothing at all. Sienna stumbled forward from the sudden loss of the burden she had been bracing against, catching herself with her hands on her knees as she gasped for breath. When she looked up, her eyes had to travel upward for what seemed like an impossibly long time. The man who had taken her brother was built like the mountains themselves, all broad shoulders and thick muscle visible even through his worn flannel shirt. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with dark hair that hung past his collar in waves that caught the lamplight from the saloon behind them. His beard was trimmed close to his jaw, revealing a face that was all hard angles and weathered planes, the kind of face that came from years of living rough in the high country, but it was his eyes that caught her, held her frozen in place. They were a startling shade of gray like storm clouds over the Sierra Nevada, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat for an entirely different reason than exhaustion. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "You look about ready to collapse." Sienna straightened, trying to gather what remained of her dignity. She was aware of how she must look, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her dress dusty and rumpled, her face flushed from exertion. At 21, she prided herself on her independence and capability, on the fact that she had managed to keep herself and Tommy afloat since their parents had died 2 years ago. The last thing she wanted was to appear weak or helpless in front of this stranger, no matter how kind his intervention. "I can manage," she said, hearing the breathlessness in her own voice and hating it. "Thank you for your help, but I can take it from here." The man's expression did not change, but something flickered in those gray eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or maybe skepticism. He adjusted his grip on Tommy, who hung limp in his arms and tilted his head slightly. "He lives far?" "Just a few blocks. The boarding house on Sierra Street." The words came out despite her intention to send the stranger on his way. The truth was her arms felt like jelly, her back ached something fierce, and the thought of trying to haul Tommy the rest of the way home made her want to sit down in the middle of the street and cry. "Then I will carry him there." It was not a question or an offer. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered in that same calm, deep voice. Sienna opened her mouth to protest, but the man was already walking, moving with surprising grace for someone of his size. She had no choice but to follow, her shorter legs working to keep pace with his long strides. They walked in silence for a moment, their footsteps echoing on the boardwalk. Sienna studied the stranger from the corner of her eye, trying to place him. She knew most of the faces in Reno, at least by sight. It was not such a large town that strangers went unnoticed, especially not strangers who looked like they could wrestle bears and come out the winner. "I have not seen you around town before," she ventured, partly to break the silence and partly because she was genuinely curious. "Just came down from the mountains yesterday," he replied, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "Needed supplies." Figured I would resupply here before heading back up. A mountain man, then. That explained the build, the weathered look, the air of comfortable solitude that seemed to surround him. Men like him were a dying breed in 1882, relics of an earlier time when the West had been truly wild. Most of them had moved on or settled down, but a few still clung to the old ways, living in the high country and coming down to civilization only when necessity demanded it. "What is your name?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, bold and forward in a way that would have scandalized her mother. He glanced at her then, really looked at her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with exertion. Up close, in the better light of the street lamps, she could see the small scar that ran through his left eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners as if he was not entirely unused to smiling, even if he was not doing so now. "Gabriel Ironwood," he said. "And you, Sienna Dalton." She gestured weakly at the burden in his arms. "This is my brother, Tommy." Gabriel nodded once, as if this information confirmed something he had already suspected. "He makes a habit of this?" The blunt question caught her off guard. Most people in town were too polite or too aware of social niceties to ask such things directly. But Gabriel Ironwood did not strike her as a man who wasted time with polite fictions. "More often than I would like," she admitted, surprised at her own honesty. "Since our parents passed, he has been struggling. The work in the mines is hard, and the whiskey makes it easier, or so he says." "Whiskey does not make anything easier," Gabriel said, his voice flat. "It just makes you forget for a while. Then you wake up and everything is still there. Except now you have got a headache and shaking hands to go with it." There was something in his tone, some undercurrent of personal experience, that made Sienna look at him more closely. But his expression gave nothing away, his face as impassive as if they were discussing the weather. They turned onto Sierra Street, a quieter residential area where the buildings were smaller and more worn than those on the main thoroughfare. The boarding house where Sienna and Tommy rented rooms was near the end of the block, a two-story structure with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. "This one," Sienna said, moving ahead to open the front door. The hinges squeaked in protest, and she winced, hoping they had not woken Mrs. Henderson, the landlady who lived on the first floor and had opinions about everything, particularly about young women who came home after midnight. Gabriel carried Tommy up the narrow staircase as if he weighed nothing at all, following Sienna's directions to the room at the end of the hall that her brother called home. The door was unlocked, naturally, because Tommy never remembered to lock anything when he left for his drinking sessions. The room was small and sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a battered dresser, and a single chair with a broken rung. It smelled of unwashed clothes and stale air, and Sienna felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her at what Gabriel must think of them, of her family, of the way they lived. But Gabriel's face showed no judgment as he laid Tommy carefully on the bed, settling him on his side and tucking a thin pillow under his head. He pulled off Tommy's boots and set them neatly beside the bed, then straightened and turned to face Sienna. "You should put a bucket beside him," he said, "in case he gets sick in the night. And make sure he drinks water when he wakes, as much as he can handle." Sienna nodded, grateful for the practical advice, even as she wondered how many drunks Gabriel Ironwood had dealt with in his time. She moved to find the bucket kept in the corner of the room, filling it with water from the pitcher on the dresser. When she turned back, Gabriel was watching her with that same intense gaze, and she found herself unable to look away. In the dim light of the single lamp, he looked even larger, his shadow stretching across the wall like something out of a story. But there was nothing frightening about him, she realized. Instead, there was something almost reassuring in his solid presence, in the quiet competence with which he had handled the situation. "Thank you," she said softly. "Truly, I do not know what I would have done if you had not come along." "You would have managed," Gabriel replied, his voice equally quiet. "You were already managing when I found you." The simple confidence in his words did something strange to her chest, made it feel tight and warm at the same time. When was the last time someone had expressed faith in her abilities, in her strength? Most people in town either pitied her for her circumstances or looked down on her for her brother's behavior. No one seemed to see her as capable, as strong, as worthy of respect. But Gabriel Ironwood, who had known her for all of 15 minutes, seemed to see something in her that others missed. They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them, filled with something Sienna could not quite name. Then Gabriel moved toward the door, and the spell was broken. "Wait," Sienna said, following him out into the hallway and pulling the door shut behind her. "At least let me walk you out. It is the least I can do." Gabriel did not argue, simply waited for her to lead the way back down the stairs. When they reached the front porch, Sienna paused, suddenly reluctant to let him disappear back into the night, back up into his mountains where she would likely never see him again. "Will you be in town long?" The question sounded too eager, too hopeful, and she bit her lip as soon as the words were out. "A few days," Gabriel said. He leaned against the porch railing, and the wood creaked under his weight. "Need to get supplies, sell some furs. Maybe get a decent meal or two before I head back up." "Where do you stay? When you are in the mountains, I mean." Sienna found herself genuinely curious about this man and the life he led, so different from anything she had known. "I have got a cabin up near Lake Tahoe, about a day's ride from here if you know the trails." He looked up at the sky, where stars were beginning to emerge from behind scattered clouds. "It is quiet up there, peaceful, just me and the trees and the snow in winter. Does it not get lonely?" The question slipped out before she could consider whether it was too personal. Gabriel's gaze returned to her, and she thought she saw something soften in his expression. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. I learned that a long time ago." Sienna nodded slowly, thinking of the past 2 years, of the weight of responsibility she had carried, of the nights she had lain awake worrying about money and Tommy in the future. She had been surrounded by people, living in a town full of noise and activity, and yet she had never felt more alone in her life. "I think I understand," she said quietly. They stood in comfortable silence for another moment, and then Gabriel straightened, pushing away from the railing. "You should get some rest," he said. "Check on your brother in a few hours, make sure he is breathing steady and not choking on anything." "I will," Sienna promised. Then, before she could lose her courage, she added, "If you need anything while you are in town, anything at all, I work at the general store on weekdays, from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. Just if you needed anything." She was rambling, she knew, but Gabriel did not seem to mind. Instead, something that might have been a smile ghosted across his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "I will keep that in mind," he said. Then he touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a brief salute and stepped down off the porch, his boots hitting the dirt with soft thuds. Sienna watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller in the darkness until he turned a corner and disappeared from view. Only then did she allow herself to release the breath she had been holding, her hand coming up to press against her chest where her heart was beating far too fast. She did not know what had just happened, could not explain the strange connection she had felt to a man she had just met. But as she climbed the stairs back to her own room, exhausted and aching and somehow lighter than she had felt in months, Sienna found herself hoping with desperate intensity that Gabriel Ironwood would take her up on her offer, that he would come to the general store, that she would see him again. Salif did not come easily that night. Sienna lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the boarding house settling around her. Every few hours she crept down the hall to check on Tommy, finding him each time exactly as Gabriel had left him, sleeping heavily on his side with his breathing deep and regular. As dawn began to paint the sky outside her window in shades of pink and gold, Sienna finally drifted off, her dreams filled with gray eyes and quiet strength and the ghost of a smile that had made her heart skip in her chest. The next morning arrived too soon, announced by the harsh clanging of the church bells that marked 6 o'clock. Sienna dragged herself from bed, every muscle in her body protesting the previous night's exertions. She washed her face in the cold water from her basin, pinned her dark hair back into a semblance of neatness, and pulled on her work dress, a simple gray cotton that had seen better days, but was clean and pressed. Tommy was awake when she checked on him, sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands. He looked terrible, his face pale and drawn, his eyes bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. "Feeling poorly?" Sienna asked, keeping her voice neutral despite the frustration that simmered beneath her calm exterior. "Like I got kicked by a horse," Tommy muttered, his voice rough and gravelly. "How did I get home? I brought you home from the Silver Dollar. Or rather, a stranger helped me bring you home because you were too drunk to walk." Sienna crossed her arms over her chest, watching her brother's face for any sign of shame or regret. Tommy winced, though whether from her words or the pain in his head, she could not tell. "Sorry, Sienna. I did not mean to make you come out so late. The boys were buying rounds and I thought one more would not hurt and then you could not stop." Sienna finished for him, her voice sharp. It is the same every time, Tommy. You say it will be different. You promise you will be more careful, and then I get called to scrape you off a saloon floor in the middle of the night. I know. Tommy's voice was small, defeated. I know, and I am sorry. I will do better, I swear it. Sienna wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But she had heard the same promises too many times before, had seen the cycle repeat itself over and over, until she no longer had the energy to hope for change. You need to eat something, she said, instead of voicing any of the angry, frustrated thoughts swirling in her head. And drink water, lots of it. I have to go to work, but I will check on you at lunch. She left before Tommy could respond, before the tears burning behind her eyes could spill over. The walk to the general store took 15 minutes, and she used every second of it to compose herself, to push down the complicated tangle of love and anger and worry that her brother inspired in her. The general store was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, a kind couple in their 50s who had hired Sienna 6 months ago when they realized they needed extra help with the increasing business. It was not glamorous work, but it was steady, and the Pattersons were fair employers who did not mind that Sienna sometimes had to leave early or come in late because of Tommy's problems. The morning passed in a blur of familiar tasks. Sienna restocked shelves, helped customers find what they needed, measured out flour and sugar and coffee into paper packets, and kept the front counter neat and organized. It was mindless work for the most part, which was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because it required little thought, allowing her tired mind to rest. A curse because it gave her too much time to think about the previous night, about Gabriel Ironwood, and the way he had appeared out of nowhere like something from a fairy tale. She was measuring out nails for old Mr. Cooperman when the bell above the door chimed, announcing a new customer. Sienna called out that she would be with them in a moment, focused on making sure she had the count exactly right. When she finally looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Gabriel Ironwood stood just inside the doorway, seeming to fill the entire space with his presence. In the daylight streaming through the store's windows, he looked even more imposing than he had the night before. His flannel shirt was faded blue, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. His dark hair was pulled back with a leather cord, revealing the strong lines of his face, and those gray eyes found hers immediately, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her forget, for a moment, how to breathe. "Miss Dalton," he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the store. "I was hoping I might find you here." Sienna was aware of Mr. Cooperman's interested gaze bouncing between them, of Mrs. Patterson looking up from her work at the back counter with unconcealed curiosity. She cleared her throat, trying to find her professional voice. "Mr. Ironwood, welcome. What can I help you with today?" Gabriel approached the counter, and Sienna caught the faint scent of pine and wood smoke that seemed to cling to him. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and laid it on the counter between them. "Got a list of supplies I need. Was hoping you could help me gather them." His fingers brushed hers as she reached for the list, and Sienna felt a jolt of something electric run up her arm. She pulled her hand back quickly, unfolding the paper, and focusing on the neat handwriting that spelled out various items. Flour, salt, coffee, sugar, dried beans, bacon, ammunition, lamp oil, matches. The practical necessities of a man living alone in the wilderness. "I can put this together for you," Sienna said, grateful to have something concrete to focus on. "It will take maybe 20 minutes. Would you like to wait or come back?" "I will wait," Gabriel said. He glanced around the store, taking in the shelves packed with goods, the barrels and crates, the neat organization that Mrs. Patterson insisted upon. "If that is all right, of course." Sienna hesitated, then added, "How is your morning going? Get some rest last night?" "Enough." Gabriel's expression softened slightly. "How is your brother?" "Miserable as he deserves to be," Sienna replied, then immediately regretted the harsh words. "I am sorry. That was unkind, but honest," Gabriel observed. Nothing wrong with honesty. Sienna found herself smiling despite everything. There was something refreshing about Gabriel's straightforward manner, the way he did not seem to expect her to pretty up the truth or hide behind polite lies. She began gathering the items on his list, moving efficiently through the store. Gabriel watched her work, and she was acutely aware of his gaze following her movements. It should have made her nervous or uncomfortable, but instead she found it strangely steadying, as if his attention was a physical thing lending her strength. "You are good at this," Gabriel said after a few minutes. "Efficient. I have been working here for 6 months," Sienna replied. measuring out coffee beans into a bag. You learn where everything is after a while. It is more than that. Gabriel leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. You have got a system. You do not waste movement or time. That comes from discipline, not just practice. Sienna felt warmth creep into her cheeks at the compliment. I suppose I have always been organized. My mother used to say I was born serious, that even as a baby I would line up my toys in neat rows. Nothing wrong with that, Gabriel said. World could use more people who think things through. They fell into an easy conversation as Sienna continued filling his order. She asked him about life in the mountains, and he told her about his cabin, about the wildlife he encountered, about the peace of waking up to nothing but birdsong and wind through the pines. In turn, he asked about her life in Reno, and she found herself opening up more than she intended, telling him about her parents' death in a wagon accident, about the struggle to keep Tommy on track, about her dreams of saving enough money to perhaps open her own business someday. What kind of business? Gabriel asked, genuine interest in his voice. A bakery, maybe, Sienna said, surprised at herself for admitting this dream she had barely acknowledged even to herself. I am good at baking, and people always need bread. It would be mine, something I built, something that did not depend on anyone else. That is a good dream, Gabriel said. Worthy one. The simple validation made something warm unfurl in Sienna's chest. She finished gathering the last of his supplies, totaling up the cost and taking his payment. Their fingers brushed again during the exchange, and this time neither of them pulled away immediately. Thank you, Gabriel said, his voice lower, quieter, meant only for her ears despite the presence of the Pattersons and the other customers in the store. For the supplies and for the conversation. You are welcome, Sienna managed, her mouth suddenly dry. Will you? That is, do you think you might stop by again? Before you head back up to the mountains? Gabriel's eyes searched her face, and Sienna had the distinct feeling he was seeing past all her carefully constructed defenses, seeing the loneliness and hope and fear she tried so hard to hide. Yes, he said finally. I think I will. He gathered his supplies and left, and Sienna watched through the window as he loaded everything into saddlebags on a massive roan horse tied outside. He swung up into the saddle with easy grace, and for a moment she thought he might ride off without looking back. But at the last second, he turned his head, his eyes finding hers through the window glass, and he nodded once before guiding his horse down the street. Well now, Mrs. Patterson said, appearing at Sienna's elbow and making her jump. That was certainly interesting. He needed supplies, Sienna said, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled with amusement, and I suppose that explains why you were blushing like a schoolgirl the entire time he was here. I was not. Sienna started to protest, then gave up. There was no use denying it, not when Mrs. Patterson could read people like books. He helped me with Tommy last night, carried him home when I could not manage the weight anymore. Did he now? Mrs. Patterson's expression turned more serious. That was kind of him. Mountain men are a strange breed, keep to themselves mostly. For him to stop and help a stranger says something about his character. He seems like a good man, Sienna said quietly. He does indeed. Mrs. Patterson patted her arm. And he certainly seemed taken with you, dear. I have not seen a man look at a woman like that in quite some time. Sienna wanted to ask what she meant by that. Wanted to know if Mrs. Patterson had seen something real, or if she was just indulging in wishful thinking. But before she could form the question, the bell above the door chimed again, and a rush of customers swept into the store, demanding attention and pushing all thoughts of Gabriel Ironwood temporarily from her mind. But only temporarily. As the day wore on, Sienna found her thoughts returning again and again to the mountain man with the storm-gray eyes, to the way he had listened to her as if her words mattered, to the careful way he had handled her brother, and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. She was being foolish, she told herself sternly during a brief lull in the afternoon. Gabriel Ironwood was passing through, nothing more. He would get his supplies, maybe stay in town a day or two more, and then he would disappear back into his mountains and she would never see him again. There was no point in building castles in the air, no point in hoping for something that could never be. But when her shift ended at 6 o'clock and she stepped out onto the boardwalk, her heart still leaped at the sight of Gabriel sitting on the bench outside the store, clearly waiting for her. He stood when he saw her, unfolding his considerable height with that same easy grace she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "Miss Dalton," he said, "I was hoping you might let me walk you home." You do not have to do that, Sienna said automatically, even as every fiber of her being screamed, yes, please, anything to spend more time with you. I know I do not have to, Gabriel replied. I want to, if that is all right with you. How could she say no to that? How could she turn away the genuine interest in his eyes, the careful courtesy in his manner? Sienna found herself nodding, and then Gabriel was falling into step beside her, his long strides shortened to match her pace. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the evening air cooling around them as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Reno was coming alive with the energy that marked the transition from day to night, people emerging from their homes and businesses to enjoy the pleasant spring weather. How was the rest of your day? Gabriel asked as they turned onto a quieter street. Busy, Sienna replied. We had a rush in the afternoon, people stocking up before the weekend. How was yours? Got the rest of what I needed. Visited the blacksmith about some repairs, sold some furs at the trading post. He paused, then added, mostly I have been thinking. About what? The question came out more breathless than Sienna intended. Gabriel stopped walking, turning to face her fully. They were standing beneath a large cottonwood tree, its branches providing dappled shade from the slanting evening light. Around them, the sounds of the town seemed to fade, creating a bubble of privacy in the midst of the busy street. About you, Gabriel said simply. About how I have not been able to get you out of my head since last night. Sienna's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her with such direct honesty before, without games or coyness or pretense. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I have been thinking about you too, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel's hand came up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted. His fingers were gentle as they tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the calloused pads of his fingertips brushing against her cheek in a touch that made her shiver. I was not planning on this, he said, his voice rough. I came to town for supplies, nothing more. I have been living alone in those mountains for 3 years, and I was content with that. Happy, even. And then I saw you struggling with your brother's weight, saw the determination on your face, the way you refused to give up even though you were clearly exhausted, and something in me just, he broke off, shaking his head. I do not have pretty words, Sienna. I am not good at talking about feelings. But I know what I feel, and I feel drawn to you in a way I have never experienced before. Sienna's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Gabriel must be able to hear it. She reached up, her hand covering his where it still rested against her cheek, holding it there. I feel it too, she said. This pull between us, I do not understand it, but I feel it. I am supposed to leave in 2 days, Gabriel said. Head back up to my cabin before the next supply trip. But I find myself wanting to stay longer, wanting to know you better, wanting to see where this could go. Then stay, Sienna said, the words coming from some brave part of her she did not know existed. A few more days, let us see what this is. Gabriel's expression transformed, the serious intensity giving way to something warmer, softer. It was not quite a smile, but it was close, and it made him look younger, less weathered by whatever hardships had driven him into the mountains in the first place. All right, he said, I will stay. They resumed walking, but everything felt different now. The air seemed charged with possibility, with the promise of something new and precious unfolding between them. When they reached the boarding house, Gabriel walked her all the way to the door, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back in a way that felt both protective and intimate. Can I see you tomorrow? He asked, after you finish work? Yes, Sienna said immediately. Yes, I would like that very much. Good. Gabriel's hand came up again, this time brushing his knuckles along her jawline in a touch that was there and gone almost too quickly to register. Sleep well, Sienna. You too, Gabriel. She watched him walk away. Her hand pressed against the doorframe for support because her knees felt suddenly weak. When he disappeared around the corner, she finally allowed herself to move, climbing the stairs to her room in a daze. Tommy was out, probably at the saloon again despite his promises that morning. Sienna told herself she should be worried, should be angry, should be preparing for another late-night rescue mission. But for once, her brother's problems seemed distant and small compared to the enormity of what was happening with Gabriel. She had known him for barely 24 hours, and yet she felt more connected to him than to people she had known her entire life. It was irrational, the stuff of dime novels and fairy tales. But it was also real. She could not deny the racing of her heart, the warmth that spread through her chest when she thought of him, the way her skin still tingled where he had touched her. Sienna prepared for bed mechanically, her thoughts a million miles away. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the boarding house around her, she allowed herself to wonder what might happen if Gabriel stayed in town longer than a few days. What if he decided to stay permanently? What if whatever was building between them grew into something real and lasting? She knew she was getting ahead of herself, knew that building hope on such a fragile foundation was dangerous. But as sleep finally claimed her, Sienna let herself dream of storm-gray eyes and gentle touches and a future that might, just might, be different from the lonely present she had resigned herself to. The next day dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring morning that made everything seem possible. Sienna woke early, feeling more rested than she had in weeks despite the swirl of emotions keeping her mind active late into the night. She took extra care with her appearance, choosing her nicest work dress and spending more time than usual pinning up her hair. Tommy was asleep in his room when she checked, and this time she recognized the smell of whiskey that clung to him. He had gone back to the saloon, had fallen right back into the same patterns despite his promises. Sienna felt the familiar twist of disappointment in her gut, but she pushed it aside. She could not fix her brother, could not force him to change. She had learned that painful lesson over the past 2 years. All she could do was focus on herself, on her own life and choices. Work passed quickly, helped along by Mrs. Patterson's knowing smiles, and Mr. Patterson's subtle teasing about the handsome mountain man who had come by the day before. Sienna bore it all with good grace, secretly pleased that her happiness was so obvious. Gabriel arrived at the store around mid-afternoon, ostensibly to pick up a few items he had forgotten on his list. But the way his eyes lit up when he saw her, the way he found excuses to linger near the counter and talk to her between customers, made it clear that supplies were not his only reason for visiting. "There is a place up in the foothills," he said during a quiet moment, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "About an hour's ride from here, beautiful view of the valley, especially at sunset. I was thinking, if you were willing we could ride up there this evening, after you finish work." Sienna's pulse quickened. The idea of being alone with Gabriel away from the eyes and ears of the town was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. But she trusted him, she realized. Despite knowing him for such a short time, she trusted him in a way she had not trusted anyone in a very long time. "I would love that," she said. "But I do not have a horse. You can ride with me," Gabriel replied. "If you do not mind." "Mind?" The thought of sitting in front of Gabriel on his horse, held secure by his arms, made Sienna's mouth go dry. "I do not mind at all." So it was settled. When 6 o'clock came and Sienna finished her shift, Gabriel was waiting outside with his massive roan horse. He helped her up into the saddle with easy strength, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. Then he swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins, and Sienna found herself pressed back against his broad chest as the horse began to move. They rode through town and out into the foothills, following a trail that wound up through sagebrush and scattered pines. Gabriel kept the pace easy, and Sienna relaxed into the rhythm of the horse's gait, into the solid warmth of Gabriel's body behind hers. "This is beautiful," she said as they climbed higher and the valley spread out beneath them, Reno looking small and neat from this distance. "Wait until we get to the top," Gabriel said, his breath warm against her ear. He was right. When they reached the spot he had mentioned, Sienna gasped at the view. They could see for miles in every direction. The valley floor painted in shades of green and gold, the mountains rising purple and blue in the distance. The sun was just beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Gabriel dismounted first, then reached up to help Sienna down. His hands lingered on her waist, and for a moment they stood close enough that Sienna could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. "Come on," he said, his voice slightly rough. "There is a good spot to sit over here." He led her to a flat rock that overlooked the valley, and they sat side by side, shoulders almost touching. For a while they simply watched the sunset in comfortable silence, content just to be near each other. "Tell me about your life before the mountains," Sienna said eventually. "What made you decide to live alone up there?" Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, and Sienna wondered if she'd overstepped, if the question was too personal. But then he began to speak, his voice low and measured. "I grew up in Missouri," he said. "My father was a farmer and I was the eldest of 5 children. When the war came, I enlisted, fought for the Union, saw things no person should ever have to see." He paused, his jaw tightening. When it was over, I tried to go back to the farm, tried to settle back into that life. But I could not do it. Everything felt wrong, felt too small and too loud all at once. I would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, convinced I was back in the fighting. Sienna's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. I am sorry, she said softly. Gabriel looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. I started drifting west, taking odd jobs, never staying anywhere long. Eventually, I ended up in California, then Nevada. Found my way up into the mountains and discovered that up there, alone with just the trees and the sky, my mind finally quieted. So I built a cabin and stayed. Do you ever regret it? Sienna asked. Choosing solitude. Not until now, Gabriel said, his gray eyes intense on hers. Not until I met you and realized what I might have been missing. Sienna's breath caught. The honesty in his words, the vulnerability he was showing her, touched something deep in her chest. She thought about her own life, about the loneliness she had been drowning in, about how Gabriel's presence had brought color back into a world that had been gray for so long. I am scared, she admitted. We barely know each other, and yet I feel like you have become important to me so quickly. What if this is just, I do not know, some kind of temporary madness? What if you go back to your mountains and realize you do not actually want this? Gabriel shifted, turning to face her more fully. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a gentle caress. I have been alone for 3 years, he said. 3 years of silence and solitude, and I was content with that. I thought I had found peace. But being with you these past 2 days has shown me the difference between peace and happiness. I was at peace in my mountains, Sienna, but I was not happy. Not really. You make me happy. Tears pricked at Sienna's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. You make me happy too, she whispered. You make me feel seen and valued and strong. Like I am more than just someone cleaning up her brother's messes. More than just a shop girl trying to scrape by. You are so much more than that, Gabriel said fiercely. You are brave and determined and beautiful, and anyone who does not see that is a fool. Then he was leaning in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Sienna did not want to pull away. She met him halfway, her eyes fluttering closed as his lips touched hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking something precious. But then Sienna's hands came up to grip Gabriel's shoulders. Feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the kiss deepened. Gabriel's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and Sienna felt as if she were falling and flying at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the sky had darkened to deep purple, the first stars beginning to emerge overhead. We should head back, Gabriel said reluctantly, before it gets too dark to see the trail. Sienna nodded, though the last thing she wanted was to leave this perfect moment, this bubble of happiness they had created. But Gabriel was right. So they rode back down the mountain, Sienna even more aware of every point where their bodies touched, of Gabriel's arms around her, and his steady heartbeat against her back. When they reached the boarding house, Gabriel helped her down from the horse and walked her to the door. This time when he kissed her, standing in the shadow of the porch where no one could see, it was with more confidence, more certainty. Tomorrow? He asked when they broke apart. Tomorrow, Sienna confirmed. She floated up to her room, her lips still tingling from his kisses, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Tommy was passed out on his bed again, but even that could not dim her happiness. Something was happening, something real and powerful and terrifying in its intensity. Sienna was falling in love with Gabriel Ironwood, had probably been falling from the moment he lifted Tommy's weight off her shoulders and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. The question was, what were they going to do about it? The next few days passed in a blur of stolen moments and deepening connection. Gabriel stayed in town, sleeping in a boarding house on the other side of town, and spending his days finding excuses to be near Sienna. He showed up at the general store every afternoon, sometimes with legitimate supply needs, sometimes with transparent excuses that made Mr. and Mrs. Patterson smile knowingly. Every evening, after Sienna finished work, they would spend time together. Sometimes they rode out into the foothills again, finding quiet spots to talk and kiss and simply be together. Other times they walked through town, Gabriel's hand warm and solid around hers, and Sienna stopped caring what people might think or say about her, walking out with a mountain man she barely knew. She learned more about him with each passing day. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh unexpectedly. She learned that he was surprisingly well read, that his cabin was filled with books he had collected over the years, and that he loved poetry even though he would never admit it to anyone but her. She learned that he was patient and kind, that he listened more than he talked, and that when he did speak, his words were always thoughtful and considered. And she learned that he was falling in love with her just as surely as she was falling in love with him. Gabriel, in turn, learned about Sienna. He learned about her dreams of independence, her fierce loyalty to her brother despite his problems, her quiet strength and determination. He learned that she loved to bake and that her sugar cookies were the best thing he had ever tasted. He learned that she had a sharp wit and a quick mind, that she was far better educated than most women in town because her mother had insisted on teaching her to read and do figures. He learned that she sang softly to herself when she thought no one was listening, and that her voice was sweet and clear and made something in his chest ache. On the 5th day after they met, Gabriel showed up at the general store with a serious expression that made Sienna's heart skip nervously. "Can you take a break?" he asked. "I need to talk to you about something." Sienna glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who shooed her toward the door with an understanding smile. "Go on, dear. We are slow this afternoon. Take your time." They walked to a small park at the edge of town. Finding a bench beneath a spreading oak tree, Gabriel took both of Sienna's hands and his expression intense. "I need to go back up to my cabin," he said, and Sienna's heart sank. "I have been away for a week now, and there are things that need tending, repairs that cannot wait, preparations for the summer season." "I understand," Sienna said, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice and failing miserably. "Let me finish," Gabriel said gently. "I need to go back, but I do not want to go without you. Come with me, Sienna. Come see my cabin, see the life I have up there. Spend some time away from town, away from your brother and all the responsibilities that weigh on you. Just a week or two, that is all I am asking. Give us a chance to really get to know each other without the distractions of town life." Sienna stared at him, her mind racing. What he was suggesting was scandalous, completely improper. An unmarried woman going off alone with a man to his cabin in the mountains. It would ruin her reputation, would give the gossips in town enough material to last years. But when she looked into Gabriel's eyes, saw the hope and vulnerability there, she found she did not care about scandal or reputation. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will come with you." Gabriel's face transformed, relief and joy chasing each other across his features. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and Sienna felt his heart pounding as hard as hers. "You are sure?" he asked against her hair. "I do not want you to feel pressured or to do something you will regret." "I am sure," Sienna said firmly. She pulled back enough to look up at him. "I have been living my life according to what other people think I should do for too long. It is time I did something just for me, just because I want to. What about your job? Your brother? Mrs. Patterson will understand. She has been telling me for months that I need to take some time for myself." Sienna took a deep breath. "As for Tommy, he is a grown man. He needs to learn to take care of himself. I cannot keep enabling his behavior, cannot keep putting my life on hold to clean up his messes." Gabriel studied her face as if making sure she really meant it. Then he nodded slowly. "When can you be ready?" "Tomorrow morning," Sienna said decisively. "I will talk to the Pattersons today, pack my things tonight. We can leave at first light." So it was decided. Sienna returned to the store with her heart pounding and told the Pattersons she needed to take some time away. To her relief, they were understanding and supportive, with Mrs. Patterson actually hugging her and telling her she was happy to see Sienna finally doing something for herself. That evening, Sienna packed a small bag with her few belongings and left a note for Tommy, explaining that she was taking a trip and would be gone for a couple of weeks. She told him where to find money for food, reminded him he was old enough to take care of himself, and said she hoped he would use this time to get himself together. She did not tell him where she was going or with whom. Some part of her knew that was cowardly, but she also knew that if she told Tommy the truth, he would try to stop her, would make her feel guilty for abandoning him. And she could not let that happen, could not let him talk her out of the first truly spontaneous, joyful decision she had made in years. Salim did not come easily that night. Sienna lay awake, alternating between excitement and nervousness about what she was about to do. She was taking a huge risk, trusting a man she had known for less than a week with her safety and reputation. If things went badly, if Gabriel turned out to be someone other than who he seemed, she could be putting herself in real danger. But deep in her bones, in that place where instinct lived, Sienna knew Gabriel would never hurt her. She trusted him in a way that defied logic. trusted him with a certainty that had nothing to do with time or circumstances, and everything to do with the connection that sang between them like a plucked string. So when the first light of dawn crept through her window, Sienna rose and dressed in her most practical clothes, sturdy boots and a simple dress that would be comfortable for riding. She shouldered her small bag and crept down the stairs, careful not to wake Mrs. Henderson or any of the other boarders. Gabriel was waiting outside with his horse, looking impossibly large and solid in the early morning light. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that made Sienna's stomach flip. "Ready?" he asked, taking her bag and securing it to his saddle. "Ready?" Sienna confirmed. He helped her up onto the horse, then swung up behind her, his arms coming around her in a now familiar embrace. As they rode out of Reno, leaving the waking town behind, Sienna felt as if she were riding toward her future, toward something bright and new and full of possibility. The journey to Gabriel's cabin took most of the day. They rode north and east, climbing steadily into the mountains, following trails that grew progressively narrower and less traveled. Gabriel pointed out landmarks along the way, telling Sienna stories about the land, about the wildlife they spotted in the distance, about the changing seasons in the high country. They stopped for lunch beside a crystal-clear stream, eating bread and cheese that Gabriel had packed while the horse grazed nearby. Sienna dipped her hands in the icy water, gasping at the cold, and Gabriel laughed at her expression before pulling her in for a kiss that warmed her all the way through. They reached the cabin in late afternoon, and Sienna's first sight of it took her breath away. It was nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view of Lake Tahoe sparkling blue in the distance. The cabin itself was larger than she had expected, solidly built from logs with a covered porch and a stone chimney rising from one end. "This is beautiful," Sienna breathed, sliding down from the horse before Gabriel could help her. She turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "Gabriel, this is incredible." "It is home," Gabriel said simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "Come on, I will show you inside." The interior of the cabin was clean and surprisingly well appointed. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies. A smaller room off to one side held a bed with a thick quilt, and Sienna tried not to think too hard about the sleeping arrangements, about the fact that she and Gabriel would be alone here with no one to chaperone or judge. "I will sleep out here," Gabriel said, as if reading her thoughts. "You can have the bedroom. I want you to be comfortable, Sienna. No pressure, no expectations. We are just spending time together, getting to know each other better. That is all." The tension Sienna had been carrying eased at his words. "Thank you," she said softly. Gabriel built a fire while Sienna explored the cabin, examining his books and the various tools and supplies neatly organized on shelves. Everything spoke of a man who valued order and self-sufficiency, who had built a life for himself through hard work and determination. That evening they cooked dinner together, Gabriel showing Sienna how he prepared venison with herbs he had dried from the summer before. They ate at the table, talking and laughing as the fire crackled and darkness fell outside the windows. When it was time for bed, Gabriel showed Sienna to the bedroom, bringing her fresh water for washing and extra blankets in case she got cold. He paused in the doorway, his expression soft in the lamplight. "I am glad you are here," he said. "I have been imagining showing you this place, imagining you here with me. The reality is even better than the dreams." Sienna crossed to him, rising on her toes to press a kiss to his lips. "I am glad I am here too," she whispered. "Good night, Gabriel." "Good night, Sienna." She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart full to bursting. Outside she could hear Gabriel moving around, settling in for the night. She changed into her nightgown and climbed into the bed, which smelled faintly of pine and something else, something distinctly Gabriel. As she drifted off to sleep, Sienna felt more at peace than she had in years. Here in this cabin in the mountains, away from the demands and judgments of the world, she could simply be herself. She could explore these feelings for Gabriel without fear, could let herself be vulnerable and open in a way she had not been able to in town. The next 2 weeks passed in a kind of golden haze. Sienna and Gabriel fell into an easy routine, dividing up the chores and spending their days working side by side. Gabriel taught her how to fish in the nearby streams, how to identify edible plants, how to read the signs that indicated changing weather. Sienna, in turn, brought her own skills to the partnership, organizing Gabriel's supplies more efficiently, mending clothes that had been neglected too long, and filling the cabin with the smell of fresh baked bread and cookies. But more than the practical aspects of life, They spent their time talking. Long conversations that stretched for hours, covering everything from childhood memories to philosophical debates about the nature of happiness. They told each other their fears and hopes, their regrets and dreams, building a foundation of understanding and trust that went far deeper than physical attraction, though there was plenty of physical attraction too. Every day brought new touches, new kisses, new explorations of the chemistry that crackled between them. Gabriel was always respectful, always careful to make sure Sienna was comfortable, but there was no denying the heat that built each time they were close. One afternoon, about 10 days into their stay, they were sitting on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson when Gabriel took Sienna's hand, his expression serious. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I have been thinking about since the day we met." Sienna's heart began to pound, but she kept her voice steady. "What is it?" Gabriel turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense. "I love you, Sienna. I know it is fast. I know we have not known each other long, but I cannot deny what I feel. You have brought light into my life, brought joy and purpose and connection. I was content before, but I was also lonely, even if I did not want to admit it. You have shown me what I was missing, what life could be if I had the courage to reach for it." Tears spilled down Sienna's cheeks, but they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking. "I have been falling in love with you since that first night, when you took Tommy's weight off my shoulders and looked at me like I was strong instead of struggling. You see me, Gabriel, really see me, and you make me want to be brave, to take chances, to believe in happiness again." Gabriel pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she cried against his chest. When she finally pulled back, wiping at her eyes, he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the remaining tears. "Marry me," he said, and Sienna's breath caught. "I know it is fast, I know people will think we are crazy, but I do not care. I want to build a life with you, Sienna, here in these mountains, or back in town, or anywhere else you want to go. I just want us to be together." "Yes," Sienna said without hesitation. "Yes, Gabriel, I will marry you." His kiss was fierce and tender at the same time, filled with promise and passion and love. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling through tears, holding on to each other as if they might float away otherwise. That night, they talked about the future. Gabriel said he would be willing to leave the mountains if that was what Sienna wanted, if she needed to be near town and civilization. But Sienna surprised both of them by saying she could be happy here, in this cabin surrounded by wilderness and beauty. She could have her bakery dream in a different form, she said. She could bake for Gabriel, for any neighbors they might have, for the occasional traders who passed through. And in the winters, when the snows came and they were truly isolated, she could read and bake and simply be with the man she loved. "Are you sure?" Gabriel asked. "It is a hard life up here sometimes, lonely and challenging, especially in winter. Nothing worthwhile is easy," Sienna replied. "And I would rather face challenges with you than have an easy life without you." They decided to return to Reno in a few days to make their engagement official, to be married by the minister, and have at least a few witnesses to their union. Sienna needed to collect the rest of her belongings and formally quit her job, and Gabriel wanted to make sure everything was done properly, that Sienna's reputation was protected as much as possible. But first, they had a few more days in their mountain paradise, days they spent cementing their bond and planning their future. They talked about children, about how they would manage the practical aspects of marriage, about the rhythms of life in the high country. Gabriel showed Sienna the best spots for gathering berries in summer, the trails that were safest in winter, the places where he had found the most peace during his years of solitude, and at night they sat on the porch and watched the stars. Gabriel's arm around Sienna's shoulders, both of them marveling at how quickly their lives had changed. When the day came to return to Reno, Sienna felt a pang of sadness at leaving the cabin. She had been happier here in these 2 weeks than she had been in the 2 years since her parents died. But she was also excited about the next chapter, about making their relationship official and beginning their life together properly. The ride back to town took most of the day, and they arrived in the early evening, the sky just beginning to darken. Gabriel took Sienna straight to the boarding house, wanting to make sure she was properly settled before he dealt with his own accommodations. Tommy was waiting on the porch, and Sienna's stomach sank at the expression on his face. He looked terrible, even worse than usual, his face haggard and his eyes wild. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded before Sienna had even dismounted. I have been worried sick. You have been gone for 2 weeks with no word, and I had no idea if you were alive or dead or— Tommy, calm down, Sienna said, sliding down from the horse. Gabriel dismounted behind her, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. I left you a note. I told you I was taking a trip. A note that said nothing about where you were going or who you were with, Tommy shot back. Then his eyes focused on Gabriel, and his expression darkened further. You are that mountain man from a few weeks ago. Did you take my sister off into the wilderness? Do you have any idea what people have been saying, the gossip that has been flying around town? Tommy, that is enough, Sienna said, her voice sharp. She stepped forward, putting herself between her brother and Gabriel. I am a grown woman and I make my own choices. I went with Gabriel because I wanted to, and I do not care what people are saying. You do not care? Tommy's voice rose. Sienna, you have ruined yourself. No decent man will want to marry you now, not after you have been alone with him for weeks. What were you thinking? I was thinking that for once in my life, I was going to do something that made me happy instead of always cleaning up your messes, Sienna snapped, 2 years of frustration finally boiling over. I was thinking that I deserved to have a life of my own, that I deserved to fall in love and be happy and not spend every moment worrying about you and your drinking and your problems. Tommy recoiled as if she had slapped him. My problems? Sienna, everything I do for us. I work in those mines every day to help pay our bills. And then you spend half your wages at the saloon, Sienna interrupted. Do not pretend you are doing this for me, Tommy. You are doing it for yourself, and I am tired of pretending otherwise. Before Tommy could respond, Gabriel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Dalton, I understand you are upset, but you should know that Sienna and I are engaged to be married. I love your sister, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making her happy and keeping her safe. I hope we can have your blessing, but even if we do not, nothing will change our decision. Tommy stared at Gabriel, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Engaged? You have known each other for what, 3 weeks? This is insane. It might seem fast, Sienna said, her voice softer now. But I love him, Tommy, really truly love him. He makes me happy in a way I did not know was possible, and I am asking you, as my brother, to be happy for me. Tommy looked between them, and Sienna could see the struggle on his face. Part of him wanted to keep arguing, to keep trying to control the situation. But another part, the part that was still her brother and still loved her despite his problems, seemed to recognize that this was not a fight he could win. Fine, he said finally, his voice tight. If this is what you really want, then fine. But if he hurts you, if he does anything to harm you, he will answer to me. He will not hurt me, Sienna said with certainty. She reached back and took Gabriel's hand, threading their fingers together. But thank you for caring. The tension eased slightly, though it did not disappear entirely. Tommy agreed to come to the wedding, which they scheduled for 3 days later at the small church on the edge of town. Sienna spent those 3 days in a whirlwind of activity, collecting her belongings from the boarding house, saying goodbye to the Pattersons and the other people who had been kind to her during her time in Reno. Mrs. Patterson insisted on making Sienna a new dress for the wedding, a simple but elegant design in cream-colored cotton. Mr. Patterson offered to walk her down the aisle, and Sienna accepted gratefully, touched by their kindness. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Sienna dressed carefully in her new dress, her hands shaking slightly as she pinned up her hair. She was nervous, but not because she had any doubts about marrying Gabriel. She was nervous because this felt so important, so momentous, as if her entire life had been leading to this moment. The ceremony was small and simple, attended by Tommy, the Pattersons, Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, and a handful of other townspeople who had been kind to Sienna over the years. Gabriel stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, his hair neatly combed back, his eyes fixed on Sienna as she walked down the aisle on Mr. Patterson's arm. When she reached him, Gabriel took her hand, and Sienna felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. This was where she was meant to be. This was who she was meant to be with. The minister spoke the traditional words, and they repeated their vows in clear, steady voices. When Gabriel slipped a simple gold band onto Sienna's finger, a ring he had purchased from the jeweler in town, she felt tears prick at her eyes. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister said. You may kiss your bride. Gabriel cupped Sienna's face in his hands and kissed her gently, sweetly, and Sienna heard Mrs. Patterson sniffle behind them. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling and the small congregation erupted in applause. The Pattersons hosted a small celebration at their home after the ceremony, with food and cake and good wishes all around. Even Tommy managed to be civil, shaking Gabriel's hand and telling Sienna he hoped she would be happy. As the sun began to set, Gabriel and Sienna said their goodbyes and prepared to leave for the cabin. They would spend the night at the boarding house, Gabriel having rented a room for their wedding night, and then head up to the mountains the next morning to begin their married life together. That night, in the privacy of their room, Sienna and Gabriel came together as husband and wife. Gabriel was gentle and patient, making sure Sienna was comfortable and cared for, and when they finally joined together completely, Sienna felt as if something fundamental had shifted in the universe, as if two separate pieces had finally clicked into place. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Gabriel's arms around her and Sienna's head resting on his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, and she traced idle patterns on his skin with her fingers. "Happy?" Gabriel asked, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "Beyond happy," Sienna replied. "I did not know I could feel like this, safe and loved and excited all at the same time. I will spend every day of our lives making sure you keep feeling that way," Gabriel promised. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You are mine now, Sienna Ironwood, and I am yours." "Forever ever," Sienna echoed, and she felt the truth of it in her bones. They left Reno the next morning, riding out as husband and wife toward their future in the mountains. The journey felt different this time, charged with new meaning. They were not just two people falling in love anymore. They were building a life together, creating something permanent and lasting. When they reached the cabin, Gabriel dismounted first and then turned to help Sienna down. But instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her up in his arms, carrying her across the threshold of their home in the traditional way. Sienna laughed, her arms coming around his neck as he kicked the door shut behind them. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ironwood," he said, his gray eyes warm. "It is good to be home," Sienna replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. The isolation of the cabin took some getting used to for Sienna, as did the hard physical work required to maintain their life in the high country. There were days when the loneliness crept in, when she missed having other women to talk to, missed the bustle and activity of town life, but Gabriel was always there, steady and supportive, helping her through the difficult moments and celebrating the joyful ones. They worked side by side, building additions to the cabin, clearing more land for a garden, laying in supplies for the long winter ahead. Sienna discovered she loved the rhythm of life in the mountains, loved the way the seasons changed so dramatically, loved the peace and quiet that allowed her to really hear herself think. She baked bread and cookies, which Gabriel praised extravagantly, and she began experimenting with preserving fruits and vegetables, determined to make sure they had variety in their diet even in the dead of winter. And at night, they came together in their bed, learning each other's bodies and souls, building intimacy that went far beyond the physical. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their days and their dreams, their fears and their hopes. When the first snow fell in late October, Sienna stood on the porch watching the world transform into something white and magical, and Gabriel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "Are you scared?" he asked quietly. "About being snowed in for months?" Sienna leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body. "No," she said honestly. "I have got everything I need right here." That winter was long and harsh, with snows that piled higher than the windows and temperatures that plunged well below zero. But inside the cabin, Sienna and Gabriel created their own warm haven. They read books aloud to each other, worked on various projects, made love, and talked about the future. It was during that first winter that Sienna realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice and was feeling queasy in the mornings. When she told Gabriel, his face transformed with joy and wonder. He placed his large hand on her still flat belly, his expression awed. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Sienna asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Gabriel said. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You have given me everything, Sienna. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I did not know it was possible to be this happy." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. By the time spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Sienna's belly was round and prominent. They made a trip down to Reno, where Sienna saw the doctor who confirmed that she was healthy and the baby seemed to be developing well. Tommy met them in town, and Sienna was pleased to see that he looked better than he had in years. He had stopped drinking, he told her, had found a better job working as a foreman in the mines. He was trying to get his life together, and Sienna was proud of him for making the effort. When he learned about the baby, Tommy was genuinely excited, promising to come visit after the child was born. Sienna hugged her brother tight, grateful that they had managed to repair some of the damage in their relationship. Their son was born in late July, on a warm summer night with the windows open and the smell of pine drifting through the cabin. It was a long labor, and Gabriel stayed by Sienna's side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her brow, his face etched with worry. But when the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, Gabriel's expression transformed to one of pure awe. He held his son carefully as if the infant were made of spun glass, and Sienna saw tears tracking down her husband's weathered cheeks. "He is perfect," Gabriel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Sienna, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel after Sienna's father, and the baby became the center of their world. Gabriel was a devoted father, patient and gentle despite his size and rough exterior. He would walk Samuel around the cabin when the baby was fussy, singing off-key lullabies that made Sienna smile. He fashioned a cradle with his own hands, carving it from smooth pine and decorating it with intricate designs. Sienna discovered that she loved motherhood, loved watching her son grow and change, loved the way Gabriel looked at their baby with such fierce tenderness. The cabin that had once housed a solitary mountain man now rang with the sounds of family life, with laughter and conversation, and the occasional frustrated cry from a teething infant. Tommy came to visit when Samuel was 3 months old, making the journey up to the cabin with supplies and gifts for his nephew. He stayed for a week, and Sienna was touched by how gentle her big, rough brother was with the baby, how he had clearly worked hard to overcome his demons. On his last night there, after Samuel was asleep and Gabriel had gone to check on the horses, Tommy pulled Sienna aside. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I need to apologize." "Tommy, you do not," Sienna started, but he held up his hand. "Please, let me say this. I was awful to you after Ma and Pa died. I let my grief turn into drinking, and I put all that weight on your shoulders. I made you responsible for me when you were grieving too, when you needed support just as much as I did, and then when you finally found happiness with Gabriel, I tried to make you feel guilty about it. I am so sorry, Sienna. You deserved better from me." Sienna felt tears prick at her eyes. "I forgive you," she said simply. "You are my brother, Tommy, and I love you. I am just glad you are doing better now." "I am," Tommy said, "and seeing you here, seeing how happy you are with Gabriel and the baby, it makes me believe that good things are possible. That maybe someday I will find what you have found." "You will," Sienna assured him. "I know you will." When Tommy left the next morning, riding back down toward Reno, Sienna stood on the porch with Samuel in her arms and Gabriel's arm around her shoulders, watching until her brother disappeared from view. "He is going to be all right," Gabriel said quietly. "I think so too," Sienna agreed. "I think we are all going to be all right." And they were. The years passed in a happy blur of seasons changing and children growing. When Samuel was 2, they had a daughter they named Grace, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. 3 years after that came another son, Thomas, named after Tommy, who by then had married a nice woman from Reno and had started his own family. The cabin grew along with their family, Gabriel adding rooms and expanding the structure to accommodate their growing brood. Sienna's garden flourished, providing vegetables and herbs that supplemented the meat Gabriel hunted and the supplies they bought on their twice-yearly trips to town. They were not rich, not by any measure, but they had everything they needed. They had love and laughter, health and happiness, purpose and peace. The children grew up strong and capable, learning to fish and hunt from their father, to read and bake and tend the garden from their mother. Gabriel taught all 3 children to respect the wilderness, to understand their place in the natural world. He showed them the trails he had walked for years alone, the secret places where animals came to drink, the best spots to watch the sunset. And as he taught them, Sienna would watch from the porch, her heart full to bursting with gratitude for the life they had built together. Tommy visited regularly, bringing his wife and eventually his own children. The cousins would play together while the adults talked and caught up on news. Tommy had become a successful businessman in Reno, having opened his own mining supply company, and he always brought generous gifts for his nieces and nephew. The Pattersons came up once. making the long journey to see how their former employee was doing. Mrs. Patterson declared the cabin charming and the children delightful, and she spent hours swapping recipes with Sienna and cooing over the baby. "I knew that mountain man was something special," she told Sienna on the last evening of their visit. "I could see it in the way he looked at you, like you were the sun and the moon and all the stars combined. He still looks at me that way," Sienna said softly, glancing over to where Gabriel was teaching Samuel how to whittle. "Even after all these years." "That is true love," Mrs. Patterson said. "Hold on to it, dear. Not everyone is lucky enough to find what you two have." "I know," Sienna replied. "Believe me, I know." On their 10th anniversary, Gabriel surprised Sienna by taking her on a trip, just the two of them. Tommy and his wife agreed to watch the children for a week, and Gabriel and Sienna rode out into the wilderness, camping under the stars and talking like they had in those early days of their relationship. One night, lying beside their campfire with Gabriel's arm around her and the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, Sienna thought back to that night 10 years ago when she had been struggling under her brother's weight, exhausted and frustrated and lonely. "What are you thinking about?" Gabriel asked, feeling her stillness. "About the night we met," Sienna said. "About how different my life would be if you had not stopped to help me that night. I thank God every day that I was walking down that street at that exact moment," Gabriel said. "You changed my life, Sienna. You took a lonely, isolated man and gave him a reason to live, a reason to be happy, a reason to believe in love." "We changed each other," Sienna corrected. "I was drowning before I met you, Gabriel, drowning in responsibility and worry and loneliness. You threw me a lifeline. You showed me what happiness looked like, what it felt like to be truly seen and valued and loved. And I will keep showing you that every day for the rest of our lives," Gabriel promised. He turned on his side to face her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I love you, Sienna Ironwood, more today than yesterday and more tomorrow than today." "I love you too," Sienna whispered, "forever and always." They kissed under the stars, and Sienna felt the same spark, the same connection that had drawn them together a decade ago. Time had not diminished what they felt for each other. If anything, it had deepened it, adding layers of trust and shared experience and weathered storms that made their love richer and more precious. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes and challenges, but also continued happiness. Samuel grew into a tall, serious young man, much like his father, with a love for the wilderness and a talent for tracking. Grace was bright and curious, always asking questions and wanting to learn new things. Thomas was adventurous and bold, the one most likely to get into mischief, but also the quickest to laugh. When Samuel turned 18, he announced that he wanted to build his own cabin on the far side of their property to start preparing for his own future. Gabriel helped him select the site and plan the structure, and the whole family pitched in to help with the construction. Watching her firstborn become a man, Sienna felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and melancholy. "Where did the time go?" she asked Gabriel one evening as they watched Samuel and Thomas working on the new cabin's roof. "I do not know," Gabriel replied, pulling her close, "but I would not trade a single moment of it." Grace eventually fell in love with a young doctor who came to Reno fresh from medical school in San Francisco. He was kind and intelligent, and when he asked Gabriel for permission to court Grace, Gabriel gave his blessing after extracting a promise that the young man would always treat his daughter with the respect and love she deserved. They were married in the same small church in Reno where Gabriel and Sienna had exchanged their vows so many years before. Sienna cried through the entire ceremony, and Gabriel held her hand, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Thomas followed a different path, deciding he wanted to see more of the world before settling down. He worked his way west to California, sending letters regularly to assure his parents he was safe and happy. Gabriel worried, but Sienna reminded him that Thomas needed to find his own way, just as they all had. When Gabriel and Sienna reached their 20th anniversary, they threw a party at the cabin, inviting everyone who had been important in their lives. Tommy came with his family, now including 4 children of his own. The Pattersons were too old to make the journey, but they sent a warm letter and a beautiful quilt they had made together. Samuel brought the woman he was courting, a shy but sweet girl from one of the neighboring ranches. Grace and her husband came from Reno, and even Thomas made it home, arriving 2 days before the celebration with stories of his adventures in San Francisco. The cabin and the surrounding clearing were filled with people, with laughter and music and food. Children ran everywhere, cousins and friends playing together under the watchful eyes of their parents. Gabriel had roasted a whole pig, and Sienna had baked more bread and cookies and pies than seemed humanly possible. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Gabriel called for everyone's attention. He stood on the porch with his arm around Sienna, both of them older now, their hair showing silver, their faces marked by the passage of time but still strong, still clearly in love. 20 years ago, Gabriel said, his deep voice carrying across the gathering, I met a woman who changed my life. I was living alone in these mountains, convinced I did not need anyone, convinced I was content with my solitude. And then I saw her carrying more weight than anyone should have to carry alone, and something in me knew that I had to help her. I had to know her. He turned to look at Sienna, his gray eyes as intense as they had been that first night. I could not have known then what helping you would lead to. I could not have imagined that 20 years later we would be standing here surrounded by children and grandchildren, by friends and family, celebrating a love that has only grown stronger with time. You are my best friend, my partner, the love of my life. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who did not have pretty words but who loved you with everything in him. Sienna was crying openly now, and Gabriel gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. I love you, Gabriel Ironwood, she said, her voice shaking but clear. I loved you then, and I love you now, and I will love you for whatever time we have left. You saved me that night, but you have been saving me every day since. You showed me what real love looks like, what real partnership means. You are my home, my heart, my everything. They kissed to thunderous applause and cheering, and as the party continued into the night, Sienna felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. This was what happiness looked like. This was what it meant to build a life with someone, to weather storms together and celebrate triumphs together, to raise children and grow old and still look at each other with the same love and desire that had sparked that first night. As the years continued to pass, Gabriel and Sienna settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. They had their routines, their private jokes, their ways of communicating without words. Gabriel's hair went completely silver, though his body remained strong from years of hard work. Sienna's face acquired lines around her eyes and mouth, marks of a life spent smiling and laughing. They became grandparents multiple times over. Samuel married his sweetheart and had 3 children. Grace had 2, and even Thomas eventually settled down with a spirited woman he met in Sacramento, bringing her home to meet his parents and promptly starting a family of their own. The cabin that had once housed a solitary mountain man now sat at the center of a small family compound, with Samuel's house nearby and a small guest cabin that Gabriel and Sienna had built for when Thomas and Grace came to visit with their families. On warm summer evenings they would all gather for dinner, 3 generations sitting around tables pushed together, passing food and stories and laughter. Gabriel would sit at the head of the table, Sienna at his right hand, and they would watch their children and grandchildren with quiet pride. When Gabriel turned 60, Sienna threw him a surprise party, managing to keep it secret despite their decades of knowing each other's every thought and feeling. The entire family descended on the cabin along with friends and neighbors from miles around. Gabriel was genuinely shocked, his expression making everyone laugh, and when he blew out the candles on his cake, he pulled Sienna into his arms and kissed her soundly despite the hoots and hollers from their grandchildren. Best surprise of my life, he told her later when they were alone in their room. Well, second best. You were the first charmer, Sienna teased, but she was smiling. They made love that night, slower and gentler than in their youth, but no less meaningful, no less connected. Gabriel held her afterward, his hands tracing familiar patterns on her skin, and Sienna felt the same thrill she had felt the first time he touched her, all those years ago. When Sienna turned 60 a year later, they took another trip, just the 2 of them. They rode to the spot where Gabriel had taken her on that first date, the place with the view of the entire valley. So much had changed in the 3 decades since then, but the view remained the same, timeless and beautiful. I was so nervous that day, Sienna admitted, sitting on the same flat rock where they had shared their first kiss. I could not believe that this handsome, strong mountain man wanted to spend time with me. I was the nervous one, Gabriel countered. I kept thinking you would come to your senses and realize I was just some rough hermit with nothing to offer. You had everything to offer, Sienna said. You had yourself, and that was more than enough. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set. hands clasped between them, watching the sky paint itself in familiar colors. This view, this moment, this love, it was everything. It was more than Sienna had ever dreamed possible on that night 30 years ago when she had been drowning in responsibility and loneliness. "Do you ever regret it?" Gabriel asked suddenly. "Giving up your life in town, your dreams of having your own bakery, living in civilization?" Sienna turned to look at him, seeing the genuine question in his eyes. "Not for a single second," she said firmly. "My dreams changed when I met you, Gabriel. They became better, richer, more real than anything I had imagined on my own. I got to build a life with the man I love, to raise our children in this beautiful place, to be part of something bigger than just me. How could I possibly regret that?" "I just want to make sure you are happy," Gabriel said. "That you have been happy, that I gave you the life you deserved." "You gave me everything," Sienna assured him. "And I am the happiest woman alive." As they rode back to the cabin in the gathering dusk, Sienna reflected on the strange and wonderful journey her life had taken. If someone had told her 30 years ago that she would spend her life in a cabin in the mountains, married to a man she had just met, raising children far from civilization, she would have thought them crazy. But life had a way of surprising you, of leading you down paths you never expected to walk. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those unexpected paths led you exactly where you were meant to be. The years continued their steady march. Gabriel and Sienna grew older together, their bodies slowing but their minds and hearts as sharp and connected as ever. They watched their grandchildren grow, some of them choosing to stay in the mountains like Samuel, others venturing out into the wider world like Thomas had. Tommy visited less frequently as he aged, the journey becoming harder for him, but they stayed in touch through letters. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, Sienna grieved for the brother she had loved despite his flaws. Grateful that they had mended their relationship before it was too late, Gabriel and Sienna marked their 40th anniversary quietly, just the two of them and their children. Grace wanted to throw a big party, but they declined, preferring instead to spend the day the way they had spent so many days, working together in comfortable silence, talking about everything and nothing, simply being together. That evening, sitting on the porch and watching the stars emerge, Gabriel pulled Sienna close and said, 40 years and I still cannot believe my luck." "Our luck," Sienna corrected. "We were lucky to find each other." "True," Gabriel agreed. "But I still think I got the better end of the deal. You could have had anyone, and you chose me. I chose you because you were the only one who saw me," Sienna said. "The only one who looked past the struggling, exhausted girl and saw the strong woman underneath. You believed in me before I believed in myself. And you gave me a reason to come back down from my mountain," Gabriel replied. "A reason to rejoin the world, to believe in love and family and connection. We saved each other, Sienna." "Yes," she agreed softly. "We did." They sat in peaceful silence, and Sienna thought about that night 40 years ago, about the weight of her brother's drunken body threatening to drag her down, about the moment when Gabriel had appeared and lifted that burden away. He had been carrying her ever since, she realized, not physically but in every other way that mattered, supporting her, believing in her, loving her, and she had carried him too, had given him purpose and family, and a reason to keep living instead of just existing. When Gabriel passed away at the age of 78, it was peacefully in his sleep, in the bed they had shared for nearly 45 years. Sienna woke that morning to find him still and quiet beside her, his face peaceful, his hand still clasped in hers. She did not scream or cry out. She simply held his hand for a long time, memorizing the lines of his face, the silver of his hair, the strength that remained even in death. She told him she loved him, thanked him for the life they had built together, promised him she would be all right. The funeral was held in Reno, with half the town turning out to pay their respects to the mountain man who had become something of a legend. Samuel, Grace, and Thomas stood with their mother, along with dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them mourning the loss of a man who had been the center of their family, the foundation on which everything else was built. Sienna accepted the condolences with grace, her back straight and her head high. She grieved, deeply and truly, but she did not break. Gabriel had taught her to be strong, had shown her that she had always been strong, and she would honor his memory by continuing to live with the same courage and determination he had shown throughout his life. She moved back to the cabin after the funeral, despite her children's protests that she should come live with one of them. But the cabin was her home, the place where she had been happiest, and she could not imagine leaving it. Samuel visited every day, and Grace came once a week, and Thomas made the trip from Sacramento once a month. The grandchildren stopped by regularly, keeping her company and making sure she was cared for. Sienna filled her days with reading and baking and working in her garden. She wrote in a journal, recording memories of her life with Gabriel, stories she wanted to preserve for future generations. She sat on the porch in the evenings and talked to Gabriel as if he were still there beside her, telling him about her day, about the grandchildren's antics, about how much she missed him. One evening, about a year after Gabriel's death, Sienna was sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Samuel came to visit. He sat beside her, quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Are you happy, Ma?" he asked. "I worry about you up here alone." Sienna considered the question carefully. "I am at peace," she said finally. "I miss your father every moment of every day. There is a hollow space in my chest where he used to be, and I do not think it will ever be filled. But I am not unhappy, Samuel. I had 45 years with the love of my life. I had children and grandchildren, and a life full of meaning and purpose. I watch sunsets like this one with your father hundreds of times, and every time I see one now, I remember how lucky I was to have him." "He was the lucky one," Samuel said, "having you." "We were both lucky," Sienna replied, smiling at her son. "And I am lucky still to have you and your siblings, to have all these grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Your father and I built something lasting, Samuel. It lives on in all of you." Samuel reached over and took his mother's hand, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the sun painted the sky in familiar shades of orange and pink. Sienna lived another 5 years after Gabriel's death, remaining in the cabin and maintaining her independence despite her advancing age. She finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83, in the same bed where she had slept beside her husband for so many years. Her children found her the next morning, her face peaceful, one hand stretched out to the empty space beside her, as if reaching for Gabriel even in death. On her nightstand was her journal, open to the last entry she had written the night before. Samuel picked it up with trembling hands and read his mother's final words. "I saw Gabriel in my dreams tonight, standing in that spot where we had our first date, looking young and strong and whole. He was smiling at me, holding out his hand. I think I will go to him soon. I am ready. I have had a wonderful life, full of love and laughter and purpose. I have no regrets, only gratitude. To my children and grandchildren who will read this someday, remember that love is the only thing that truly matters. Everything else fades away, but love endures. Your father taught me that, and I am grateful every day for the night he saw me carrying a weight I could not bear alone, the night he carried me home and made sure I was safe. He kept me safe for the rest of his life, and he is waiting to keep me safe still. I am going home to him now. Be happy for me." Samuel's tears fell onto the page as he finished reading, but he was smiling through them. His siblings gathered around, and they read their mother's words together, finding comfort in her final message. The funeral was held on a bright summer day, and Sienna was buried beside Gabriel in a small cemetery overlooking the valley they had both loved. The entire family gathered, 3 generations strong, to say goodbye to the woman who had been the heart of their family. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in those familiar shades of orange and pink, Samuel stood with his siblings and children and grandchildren, looking out at the view his parents had loved so much. "They built something special," Grace said quietly. "Something that will last," they did, Thomas agreed, "and it lives on in all of us." Samuel thought about his father, the strong mountain man who had been capable of such gentle love. He thought about his mother, the determined woman who had chosen love and adventure over safety and convention. He thought about the story they had told many times over the years, about how they met one night in Reno, how Gabriel had carried Tommy home, and how that simple act of kindness had led to a lifetime of love. "They saved each other," he said out loud. That is what they always said. They saved each other. And as the stars began to emerge overhead, the same stars that had witnessed Gabriel and Sienna's love story, from its beginning to its end, the family stood together and remembered the couple who had built a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of love, commitment, and family. It was a legacy that would endure for generations, passed down through the stories they told and the values they had instilled. Gabriel and Sienna's love story had started with a simple act of kindness on a dark street in Reno, and it had grown into something extraordinary, something that touched everyone who knew them. They had found each other against all odds, had built a life together in the wilderness, had created a family that spanned generations. They had faced challenges and overcome them, had supported each other through good times and bad, had loved each other with a depth and constancy that was rare and precious. And now they were together again, reunited in whatever lay beyond this life, still carrying each other, still keeping each other safe, still loving each other with the same intensity that had sparked on that first night so many years ago. Their story was complete, and it was a happy ending in the truest sense. Not because it ended with them living forever, but because it ended with a life well lived, a love well loved, and a legacy that would continue to grow and flourish in the hearts of those they left behind. In the years that followed, the family cabin became a gathering place, kept up by Samuel and eventually passed down to his children. Every summer the family would come together there, bringing their children and grandchildren, telling stories of Gabriel and Sienna, keeping their memory alive. And sometimes, on warm summer evenings when the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the younger generation would swear they could feel a presence on the porch, a sense of peace and love that seemed to linger in the mountain air. They would tell each other it was just the wind or their imagination, but deep down they knew better. Gabriel and Sienna were still there, still watching over the family they had created, still loving each other across the veil that separated life from death. Their love had been strong enough to last a lifetime, and it was strong enough to last beyond, a testament to the power of two people who had found each other, saved each other, and built something that would never truly end. And so the story came full circle. From that first night, when a mountain man saw a woman carrying a drunk man's weight and chose to help her, to the legacy that lived on in the hearts and lives of everyone they had touched. It was a love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the Wild West, and it proved that sometimes the greatest adventures began with a simple act of kindness and a willingness to take a chance on love.